Joining us now in New York, New York, Seth Mnookin, author of The Panic Virus, a true story of medicine, science, and fear. Seth, good of you to join us on the line from the Big Apple. How are you tonight?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. Because this is a bit of, history that people kind of have a grasp of but don't remember all the niceties and all the details. Let's go through this chronologically here. Take us back to the beginning.
Sure.
Who's Andrew Wakefield?
Well, Andrew Wakefield is a British gastroenterologist, and in 1998, he was the lead author on a paper that was, as you said, published in the Lancet. And the paper was a study of 12 children, and he said that he had identified a possible link between the measles component of the MMR vaccine and a previously unidentified gut disorder, and then that gut disorder and autism. In the paper itself and in the Lancet, the journal and the other authors made very clear that this was not only speculative, but it was labeled an early report, and there was actually a commentary commissioned for the Lancet that critiqued the article. What really set this off is then a press conference that Wakefield had in which he said, I can't recommend that parents continue to give the MMR vaccine to their children.
If the science on this was premature or iffy, how did he manage to get it in the Lancet?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I tend to be, or I tend to be more forgiving of the Lancet than I am of the sort of mainstream media in this regard, because I feel like there should be a fair amount of latitude to publish preliminary results, to publish things that may lead to further research down the road. I know a lot of scientists who disagree with me on that front, and I should probably defer to them because I'm not a scientist. But what I sort of identify as the original moment of sin here was when the UK press corps then took his press conference. And instead of asking why is it that a researcher is making recommendations that differ so much from what his bosses at the medical school that he worked at said, what the editor of the Lancet said, and why is he making these recommendations based on only 12 children? What the press did was set up this sort of false equivalency, which I think is a problem oftentimes with the media, and acted as if this was an on the one hand, on the other hand debate. And I think that's what really set this off.
So in other words, the media tend to give equal weight to both sides, even if both sides aren't equally credible. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and an example I use in my book is the birther movement in the U.S., this sense that Barack Obama is not a legitimate president because he's a Nigerian foreign agent or something equally ridiculous. When that first cropped up, it was really a group of extremely fringe, I don't even know if you would call them fringe, characters who were saying this, but because it was this potentially controversial story, what you ended up with on CNN, on Fox News, again and again was, well, these people say that he wasn't born in the United States, and on the other hand, he says he was. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. That's not the same thing as being objective about which political candidate might have a more effective healthcare policy or something like that. That's taking a factual issue and pretending that it's up for question.
Okay, we get the analogy there. Tell me this, how did Wakefield manage to get, even though he had fairly iffy science and a very small sample, as you said, and he couldn't repeat that which he had quote unquote discovered the first time, how did he manage to get other collaborators to sign off on the paper that ended up in the Lancet?
Well, it's an interesting thing about scientific journals or scientific papers. You'll see 12 or 13 and sometimes even more authors, and usually you'll have a lead author and then a sort of corresponding author that also had something to do with the totality of the piece. But in many cases, some of the names might have only been analyzing a very small part of the overall data. So you might have had a measles virologist who really was only looking at the way that the measles virus could interact with the stomach wall. You might have had a hematologist. So when you see those 12 names or 13 names, I think sometimes you get the sense that all of these people signed off on this. And in fact, by now, I believe either 10 or 11 of them have disavowed the work. And a lot of them disavowed it years ago. It's an open question as to whether scientists should be more careful about the totality of what appears in papers that they share credit on.
Gotcha. Okay, so we're setting the scene here of a guy who puts out this information. The media eat it up because it's an irresistible story. This vaccine, which everybody assumes is going to save kids, is actually giving, too many children autism, so the allegation goes.
Right.
The reaction is a firestorm, and almost automatically there's a good chunk of the public that buys this hook, line, and sinker. And I wonder if you could get us inside the heads of them. Why were they apparently so mistrustful of vaccines and prepared to believe what was awfully iffy science?
Well, I think in this case, there were two things going on. One, and you've seen this happen throughout history, when vaccines are combating a disease that is endemic in a society like polio in the 1950s, then you don't have these type of speculative fears really gaining ground. On the other hand, when a vaccine is effective, essentially, and a disease recedes, then the benefits of that vaccine begin to appear increasingly notional. And by the late 90s in the UK and in the US and in Canada, measles infections had no longer had the sort of scare that they might have 30 or 40, 50 years ago when people knew kids that were very seriously affected. So I think that's one thing that was going on. Another thing, and this is really why I called my book The Panic Virus, is once you scare someone, once you introduce a fear into people's heads, it's very, very hard to unscare them. It's like if I told you, whatever you do, don't think of the word elephant. It would be very hard then not to think of the word elephant. And I think you have a similar phenomena at work here. And the final piece of the puzzle is autism, the rates of autism are increasing and were already increasing in the late 90s. And that remains a disease about which very little is known. We don't have a lot of effective early interventions or treatments. So that's something that is really touches, I think, a lot of parents' sort of primal fears about what might happen to their children.
Let me share a little chunk of the panic virus now for our viewers. Then there's measles, which is the most infectious microbe known to man and has killed more children than any other disease in history, you write. A decade after the World Health Organization declared the virus effectively eradicated everywhere in the Americas, save for the Dominican Republic and Haiti, declining vaccination rates have led to an explosion of outbreaks around the world. In Great Britain, there's been more than a 1,000-fold increase in measles cases since 2000. So here's the paradox. The more effective the vaccines are, the less necessary they seem. How do you get around that?
Well, I think one thing that we have definitely learned from this is that there has been a sort of paternalistic attitude on the part of the medical community and the public health community that really doesn't cut it anymore. The sort of notion that your doctor or your government can say, do this because we say it's good for you, might have been effective in the early 20th century when doctors were held in incredibly high esteem, scientists were held in very high esteem. But I think now the public health community around the world really needs to realize that public communication is a crucial part of their job. In this case, you had this narrative that was put forth by Andrew Wakefield and then increasingly by other people that really was allowed to continue without there being any counter-narrative, without a sort of adequate explanation being put forth of really what the risks are, both to yourself and to others if you don't vaccinate or if you don't vaccinate your children. Unfortunately, we're getting that counter-narrative because, as you said, measles rates are increasing. Whooping cough, which is even more dangerous for infants, is also increasing. And last year in California, in 2010 alone, 10 infants died of whooping cough. I think that's shocking in the 21st century. But there you have a counter narrative that I think people will be able to understand on a sort of visceral level.
Well, let me pick up on the communications angle you just put forward there, because Jenny McCarthy, former Playboy model and actress, Robert Kennedy Jr., who I think probably doesn't have a lot of trouble getting media attention, and Oprah Winfrey, who's got to be the greatest communicator and maybe the most powerful woman in America, all piled on the other side. And I guess the pro-truth side, if I can put it that way, the side that actually had the facts on their side, are, how do I ungenerously put this, a bunch of nerds in lab coats who don't know how to communicate most of the time. So this fight gets pretty unfair in terms of trying to get the truth out there, isn't that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly would say that Jenny McCarthy was a much more effective communicator. One point I would make is I don't think that for the most part, not across the board, but for the most part, that the people who have been arguing that vaccines are not safe are doing that for any other reason than they believe that truly to be the case. I think Jenny McCarthy truly believes that her son was injured by a vaccine.
All scientific proof to the contrary.
Well, and what she says, and this gets back to the sort of notion of narratives being, personal narratives being holding much more sway with a lot of people than numbers, is, she said this is what she saw happen in front of her eyes. And no one is going to convince her that either that could be a coincidence or possibly that her memory of events doesn't correlate exactly with what actually happened. Again, not because she's delusional or anything, but because that's how the human mind works. We tend to reorder events so that they make more sense to us, so that they create a narrative that is satisfying and life doesn't seem random.
I think what she said was, my gut as a mother tells me that what I believe to be the case is the truth, all scientific fact regardless. And it's pretty hard to argue with that, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, she said, this is my mommy instinct, and then when the issue of the scientific evidence was brought up, she said, Evan, and that's her son, she said, Evan is my science. And again, I think that's something that a lot of parents can really relate to, the sense that when it comes to their children, they absolutely know best. They should, follow their instincts about what's safe and what's not. So I don't think it's just a situation where you had a very attractive, well-spoken, obviously telegenic media personality and who is receiving a lot of attention. You had some very public figures like RFK Jr. And that they sort of hoodwinked people. I think it's much more that the argument or the ideas that were being put forth made a lot of intuitive sense to people.
Okay, a couple of minutes left in our interview before we get everybody else involved, and I want to tackle two more things. Do you know what effect your book has had on the parents of autistic children who still have no answers about the precise cause or causes of autism?
It's a very interesting question, and certainly I've received a lot of very angry messages from parents who believe that their children were harmed by vaccines. And again, I understand why they're upset. I also have received, I think, more messages than I would have expected from parents of autistic children who have said that they were thankful that someone was addressing this and bringing this up, because they hoped the conversation could shift away from from vaccines and start to look at other potential environmental triggers or address other areas of research that need funding, that need research attention. So certainly there have been people who've been very, very upset, but I think there are also a fair number of parents who are glad that this perspective is out there.
And let's come full circle. Whatever happened to Andrew Wakefield?
Well, most recently, he, about a year ago, he lost his medical license in the UK after a several-year hearing. Earlier this year, the British Medical Journal accused him of fraud in that initial paper. He lost his job at the clinic he had helped to start in Austin, Texas. Despite all that, he still very much remains a hero to some people, and is doing a book tour for his latest work. But he has been fairly sidelined for the most part.
Okay, Seth, stand by. Thanks for getting us started. We're going to broaden our discussion, invite some other guests to join us, because coming up next, how do we protect ourselves from bad or even corrupt science? Stay with us.